Lecture 8, Punctuation. The word punctuation derives from the Latin for point, that is, the marks with the sentence point to various meanings of its words, making sense of what otherwise might be a string of sounds. They serve two functions. They define how the various elements of a sentence relate to each other, thereby ensuring clear and unambiguous communication, and they help to establish the tone. The first function is more mechanical and hence more easily learned. The second is part of what distinguishes the skilled writer from the novice. Sometimes the reason for selecting one mark over other has more to do with achieving a certain nuance than with major differences in meaning. In dialogue, punctuation helps to convey intonation and style of speaking, so that the reader hears a character's words the way the writer intended. Subtleties such as pauses, emphasis, hesitancy, and changes in pitch can all be achieved through the appropriate marks. Punctuation marks defy easy categorization because all play more than one role and different marks may be used for similar purposes. Punctuation marks can be grouped by their main or best known functions as follows. Marks used to separate elements within a sentence, comma, semicolon and colon. Marks used to end a sentence, period, question mark and exclamation point. Marks used to link related elements, hyphen and slash. Marks used to set off digressions from the main flow, parentheses, dashes, brackets. Marks used with quoted material, quotation marks and ellipses. A final mark, the apostrophe, is distinct enough not to be grouped with any other. In fact, some authorities do not consider it a punctuation mark at all, but rather of the inherent spelling of a word. This ordering has been done with the recognition that the distinctions are not in fact that neat. Take the terminal punctuation marks. Periods have functions other than ending a sentence. Question marks and exclamation points occasionally appear in the middle of a sentence. A sentence may end in an ellipsis or a dash rather than in any of the above. Similarly, dashes may be used not only like parentheses, but also like colons to separate elements, and sometimes like hyphens to link elements. Missing letters and words may, depending on the specifics of what is being done, be indicated by periods, commas, semicolons, apostrophes, hyphens, ellipses, or dashes. The comma is by far the most used punctuation mark, typically outnumbering all the others put together. Its basic role is to function as an interrupter, separating a sentence into distinct units. Most of the comma's numerous functions fall into the following categories: separating the main elements of a sentence from each other, setting off a parenthetical element from the rest of the sentence, separating elements in a series, setting off dialogue or quotations, indicating omitted words. Avoiding commas with clauses. Using the comma properly means knowing both where to put it and where not to. Breaking up a string of words that ought to be treated as an indivisible unit will send just as confusing a signal to the reader as letting discrete units run into each other. Here we review the main scenarios of indivisible unit. So don't separate any of the main parts of a clause. A clause focuses on a single idea or on closely related ideas, and therefore should not be broken up. In general, you should not put commas between the subject and the predicate, between the parts of a compound subject, or between the parts of a compound predicate. Don't split the subject and predicate. For example, Rodney and his brother were the worst female impersonators we'd ever seen. Don't split the subject and the predicate, even if the predicate comes first. For example, Discreetly nestled in the tissue paper was a small plaster burst of Elvis. Don't split the verb part of the predicate from the rest. For example, what he likes best about the condominium is its no frogs policy. Don't split a compound subject. For example, the desire to succeed and the ability to do so are not the same thing. Don't split the two actions in the predicate. Lily stomped down to her dungeon and slammed the door. Don't split two descriptions in the predicate. For example, the meeting was brief and to the point. Don't split the two entities affected by the action. For example, Dudley planned to study astrophysics and numerology. Don't split the two recipients of the action. For example, she lent her sister and brother-in-law $2,000. Exceptions. Do put a comma with the clause if ambiguity would result without it. Consider the following sentence. The instructor gave out a sheet that described its course and explained how the grading would be done. She complained that he'd made a mess and stomped out in a snit. It was a shock to everyone when the consultant was arrested and the whole venture fell apart. In part 2 of the exam, answer questions A and B and C. In the first example, did the instructor give out a sheet and explain the grading, or did he give out a sheet that contained a description of the course and an explanation of the grading? It isn't clear whether the action of explaining gets attributed to the instructor or to the sheet. This sentence would be clarified by adding a comma either between the two actions performed by the instructor or between an action of the instructor and the details of what the sheet contained. So we have the instructor gave out a sheet that described his course and explained how the grading would be done. Or, the instructor gave out a sheet which described his course and explained how the grading would be done. In the second example, does the final action connect with she or with the complaint that he'd? If the first scenario is intended, she stormed out in a snit, a comma should be added, even though it would break up two actions performed by the subject. If the second scenario is intended, she complained that he'd stormed out in a snit, this would be clarified by adding had to the last verb. So, she complained that she'd made a mess and stomped out in a snit. Or she complained that she'd made a mess and had stomped out in a snit. In the third example, were people shocked by the arrest and the venture subsequently fell apart, or were they shocked by both the arrest and the loss of the venture? A comma would clarify the first scenario, changing the form of the verb would clarify the second. It was a shock to everyone when the consultant was arrested, and the whole venture fell apart. It was a shock to everyone to learn that the consultant had been arrested and that the whole venture had fallen apart. In the fourth example, is everyone expected to answer the question A and then choose between B and C, or is the choice between answering both A and B or C alone? In part 2 of the exam, answer questions A and B or C. In part 2 of the exam, answer questions A and B or C. It may also sometimes be beneficial to break up a clause that is long or complex, even if not ambiguous. Skilled writers have a feel for when comma would be a good idea, even when it isn't required according to the strict rules. Basically, you should consider putting a comma within a clause anytime you sense that doing so would make the sentence easier for readers to follow. Exceptions aside, if commas aren't normally used within clauses, where do they go? First, no comma rule applies only when there are no more than two parts of a compound subject or two subunits of any part of the predicate. Commas are needed within a clause whenever there are three or more such parts or two or more adjectives in front of a noun. Second, commas are needed within a clause if it contains any embedded parenthetical text. Third, commas are used to separate clauses from each other and to separate clauses from other elements in the sentence. Separating the main elements of a sentence. What's the difference between the following two sentences? They settled only the budget issues, and work schedules and technical matters had to be tabled until the next meeting. B. They settled only the budget issues, and work schedules and technical matters had to be tabled until the next meeting. In case A, only the budget was settled, work schedules and technical matters had to be tabled. In case B, the budget and work schedules were settled, and technical matters had to be tabled. When sentences contain multiple chunks of information, the boundaries between these chunks must be clear. Commas clarify precisely where one unit ends and the next begins. The syntax, the order in which the word appears, is not always a sufficient clue, because the same words that link elements together may also serve to link subunits within a single element. When two independent clauses are joined by a conjunction, put a comma between them. Consider the following sentence. Dust covers had been placed on the tables and the chairs, and all the smaller items had been packed away. They left early, for the concert was horrific. In the first example, look at what would happen if no comma preceded the conjunction linking the clause. Dust covers had been placed on the tables and the chairs, and all the smaller items had been packed away. Without a comma, it isn't clear at what point the sentence shifts direction. Were dust covers placed on just the tables and the chairs had been packed away along with the smaller items, or were both tables and chairs covered? Even in sentences with no ambiguity, the absence of comma might cause a fleeting confusion or hesitation on the part of the reader. Are we still on the same topic here or on a new one? I see. For instance, in the second example, if no comma preceded the conjunction for, the reader might momentarily see it as a preposition, as it is the third example. A comma sends a clear signal that whatever follows, it will involve a shift of direction. In some, without commas, a sentence may become clear only once it is read through. With them, the reader is on the top of things all along. Indicating omitted words. An elliptical constructions is the phrasing where one or more words have been deliberately dropped because they can be readily inferred. Sometimes words can be dropped without any ado. I looked distrustfully at him, and he looks distrustfully at me. I looked distrustfully at him, and he at me. In other cases, however, you need to indicate that something is missing. The way to do this is to put a comma in the place of the absent words. Use a comma to indicate omitted text if the sentence would read ungrammatically without it. For example, to err is human, to forgive divine. In spring her garden was ablaze with daffodils, in summer pansies, and in fall asters. Including the omitted words would be perfectly acceptable grammatically. Stylistically, however, it may sound a bit ponderous. Saying the same thing in fewer words often makes writer appear less awkward and more polished. Semicolon. The function of the semicolon fall into two main categories: separating elements when a comma would be insufficient or unclear, linking elements as an alternative to joining them, with a conjunction or breaking them into two sentences. In the first case, the semicolon is required for clarity. In the second case, it is chosen over other equally clear constructions in order to achieve a certain tone or emphasize a relationship. Use semicolons to separate elements that are themselves subdivided by commas. Normally, elements in a series are separated by commas. If, however, the elements are divided into sub-elements, commas wouldn't clearly indicate where one group of sub-elements ends and the next begins, because they would be indistinguishable from commas within the group. In such a case, use semicolons instead. For example, the sources of information about each patient included reviews of videotapes, nursing notes, and the researcher's log, inspection of registers, indices, and medical records, and an interview with the doctor. Here, the semicolon make it clearer where the items categorized under reviews and inspection each end. Use a semicolon to separate independent clauses that are linked by conjunction-like words. Here they are, given in the table: accordingly, afterwards, also, anyway, as a result, besides, certainly, consequently, conversely, currently, earlier, eventually, finally, for example, furthermore, hence, however, ideally, in brief, in conclusion, in contrast, in fact, in short, in particular, indeed, initially, instead, later, likewise, meantime, meanwhile, moreover, namely, nevertheless, next, nonetheless, notwithstanding, on the other hand, ordinary, otherwise, preferably, rather, similarly, specifically, still, subsequently, that is to say, then, therefore, thus, to wit, understandably. Any of these words or phrases can act as an introductory element to a clause, and many of them can also appear either embedded in the middle as a parenthetical element or at the end as a concluding element. In all these positions, they usually would be set off by commas. For example, I'd rather have the report by tomorrow. However, Monday will do. I didn't think he'd have anything to contribute to the meeting. Besides, he wasn't interested in the topic. Use semicolons if commas might cause a sentence to be misread or otherwise difficult to follow. For example, part A attaches to B, C and D attach to E, and F attaches to G. Colon. The colon acts as a signal of anticipation, drawing the reader's attention to what comes after it. In the classic reference book, Modern English Usage, the grammarian H.W. Fowler describes it as delivering the goods that have been invoiced in the preceding words. Like the semicolon, in some cases it is required and in others it is used for effect. Its functions fall into two following main categories: introducing the text that follows, strengthening connections or adding emphasis. Introducing what follows. Use a colon when the first part of a sentence is an introduction, a lead-in, or a build-up to what follows. Use a colon when a sentence contains a question-answer. A colon serves to cue readers that a sentence consists, in a sense, of a question and an answer. That is, it conveys the signal that the text preceding it has just raised an implicit question, to which the remainder of the sentence is about to provide a response. For example, the situation was becoming desperate. Supplies were running low, and winter would soon be setting in. Implied question: what was desperate about the situation? Answer: low supplies and imminent winter. Use a colon to introduce a list. This function is really just a subset of the one described above. The leading part of the sentence states the nature of the list, and the remainder provides the details. For example, any scientific measure must meet two vital criteria: reliability and validity. Period. There is not much to be said about the period, except that most people don't reach it soon enough. These are the words of William Zinsser on writing well. The period has two main functions: ending a sentence, indicating abbreviations. Don't include a period for a grammatically complete parenthesized sentence that lies within another sentence. For example, hospital workers objected that the consultant's advice on business techniques didn't apply in their environment. For example, they felt that telling desperately sick patients to have a nice day was inappropriate and was undermining rather than improving morale. Use a comma rather than a period to end a sentence in dialogue when more text follows. For example, I'm sure no one in the audience noticed when your toupee slid off, she said soothingly. Don't include a period if a sentence ends in another terminal punctuation mark, even if that mark does not apply to the sentence as a whole. For example, before you begin, be sure to read the section entitled "Should I begin?" She has that annoying habit of ending almost every sentence with "you know what I mean." If a sentence ends in an abbreviation that includes a period, do not add another period. For example, if you have any complaints about this product, send them in writing to Acme Manufacturing, Inc. Indicating abbreviations, the following are rules and guidelines on where to include periods. Initials of people's names always include periods. For example, C.S. Lewis, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Titles, honorifics. Follow the convention that is most appropriate for your audience. In North America, periods are expected. For example, Miss America, Mount St. Helens. In Britain and some other Commonwealth countries, the period is omitted for abbreviations that include the final letter of the word, thus Mrs., Mr., Dr., without period. Question mark. The question mark is a terminal punctuation mark that turns a sentence into a query. It may also be used to indicate uncertainty, tentativeness, or incredulity. There are cases where it is necessary, cases where it is optional, and cases where it is inappropriate. It has the following functions: indicating queries, optionally indicating rhetorical questions, optionally indicating requests, indicating uncertainty. Indicating queries. Use the question mark when posing a direct query. For example, were there any messages for me? How does this electric cat brush work? Use it to turn a statement into a query. You promise to tell anyone, not to tell anyone? You don't really mean that? Note that the former way of posing a question is more likely when the speaker is seeking information, and the latter when the speaker is assuming or hoping for a particular answer. In dialect, both forms of questions are common. Use it for a statement that ends in a word inflected as a query. Just leave me alone, okay? Use it for a sentence that consists of a direct question contained within a statement. For example, he was beginning to wonder, was she truly what she claimed to be? The question was, why bother even trying? Use it to achieve a tentative inflection. In dialect, you can employ question marks to impart an uncertain, a tentative tone to a character's manner of speaking. Some people have a habit of inflecting ordinary statements as questions, almost as if they are chronically expecting to be challenged on what they are saying. For example, Muriel said, "Once I was riding Alexander uptown on some errands for George, my company, and I had these two cats in the car just the day before, and I didn't think a thing about it, clean forgot to vacuum like I usually do, and all at once I turn around and Alexander's stretched across the seat flat out." And Teller, the accidental tourist. Indicating rhetorical questions. A rhetorical question, one for which no answer is expected or for which the answer is self-evident, may end in either a question mark or an exclamation point. The context determines which will be most appropriate. For example, "Isn't her singing amazing?" Indicating requests. For a request that is really a politely phrased order of instruction, decide which tone is intended. A question mark makes the words look more humble, a period more peremptory. Usually a period is more appropriate. For example, "Would you call Mr. Brown before you leave?" Translation: "It would be nice if you would." Indicating uncertainty. A minor role of the question mark is to indicate uncertainty about dates. Joan of Arc, 1412, 1431. Similarly, you may choose to follow any tentative statement of fact with the question mark enclosed with parentheses. Obviously, it will not enhance the force of your writing if this device appears often. Exclamation point. The exclamation point is a terminal punctuation mark that is used in place of the period to add emphasis or emotion. It turns simple statements into forceful ones and remarks into exclamations or outbursts. It comes up most commonly in dialect, but has a role in non-dialect text as well. Its functions are the following: indicating importance or emotion, optionally indicating rhetorical questions, drawing attention to unlikely points. Almost all of its occurrences fall into first category. The other two uses do not arise frequently. In non-dialect, the exclamation point can be used to lend emphasis or grab attention. The woman in the glasses politely let us squeeze past her to get the special sale table. Rookie. Or, for example, "We paused to survey the result. A fine mess had made of it." Indicating rhetorical questions. It is sometimes appropriate to end a rhetorical question, one for which no answer is expected, in an exclamation point instead of a question mark. For example, "How do you expect me to finish all these chores by noon?" Or, "Isn't it adorable? What on earth did she expect?" Drawing attention to a point. Some writers like to underline statements that are unlikely, ironic, or unexpected by following them with the exclamation point enclosed in parentheses. For example, after 19 pastries, Albert decided he'd had enough. While this strategy is not illegal, it demands attention a bit too loudly. It's occasionally appropriate, but as a general rule, you are better off wording things so that ironies or oddities speak for themselves. Give your reader credit to being able to pick up on subtleties. Cautions about the exclamation point. Use the punctuation mark sparingly, or it will lose its effectiveness. Rely on it to infuse excitement or importance into uninspired lines will make your writing look amateurish, or even worse, gratingly like at copying. Hyphen. We look at the hyphen as a mark of punctuation as opposed to a component of spelling. The distinction is that in its punctuation row, the hyphen is not an inherent part of a word or phrase, but rather is required only when words are presented in particular combinations or ways. The functions of the hyphen as a punctuation mark are the following: indicating word breaks at the end of a line, drawing together words that form a compound adjective, acting as a stand-in for a repeat word, indicating special intonations or pronunciations. For example, the back-to-back workshops were exhausting to sit through. Hyphenated compounds appear as their own entities in the dictionary, so it's easy to confirm if a hyphen is needed. If you don't see a compound listed, assume that it does not take a hyphen. Slash. The slash, also known as diagonal or slant, or more esoterically as a solidus or verglue or shilling, is a somewhat nebulous mark. There are a couple of situations where no other punctuation will do, but often it is used as a casual shorthand for more precise modes of expression. Since it runs the risk of being ambiguous, it should be applied with caution. In more formal genres of writing, such as that expected for academic journals, it may be considered too informal or imprecise to be used at all. The functions of the slash are as follows: to indicate "and" or relationships, indicating various other relationships between words or numbers, separating lines of poetry. Indicating "and" or relationships. The slash may be variously used to indicate options, dual roles, and alternatives. As a symbol for "and", it may be used to identify an entity that has more than one characterization or function. For example, she liked to describe her position as that of Vice President of Finance's babysitter. Indicating other relationships. Apart from indicating and or relationships, the slash may be used for the following purposes: separating elements that are being compared. For example, the Toronto-Montreal hockey rivalry has its heyday in the 60s. Separating origins and destinations. The Los Angeles-Sydney flight was fully booked. Separating the numerals, making up a date. The 11th of November, 1922. Indicating a period spanning 2 calendar years. Academic year 2022-2023. As a shorthand designation for per. 100 kilometers per hour, indicating division of fractions, 3/4. Separating lines of poetry. Use the slash to separate lines of poetry or song that are run in with a prose sentence. For long excerpts, set off the lines vertically. Dalglish said, "Now the day is over, night is drawing nigh, shadows of the evening fall across the sky." It is a Sunday school hymn, hardly the kind that gets requested on songs of praise, I should have thought. P.D. James, Devices and Desires. Parenthesis. The function of parenthesis is to set off an element that interrupts a flow of thought significantly. The element must be relevant enough to merit being worked in where it is, but enough of an aside to require being set off distinctly. Text that is appropriate for parentheses is usually either an explanation, amplification, or example of the topic the sentence is dealing with, or some digression that bears a relationship to the topic, but not a tight one. If a digression, it must not be a non sequitur, something with no logical connection to any previously said. It must have some bearing on what precedes it, and this connection should be evident to the reader. Parentheses are not simply places to stash stray bits of information that don't quite fit in anywhere else. Digressive elements may be set off with either commas, dashes, or parentheses. Thus, how do you decide when it's appropriate to use each? Sometimes the decision is obvious. Sometimes it's more a matter of achieving a particular tone. In general, commas serve to integrate a digressive element unobtrusively. Dashes serve to draw particular attention to it, and parentheses serve to de-emphasize it, signaling to the reader that the text is temporarily getting off the track. These distinctions aren't hard and fast, though, and in some cases the effect of parentheses may be to draw more, rather than less, attention to what they enclose. It very much depends on context. Don't overuse parentheses, as they can be distracting and may make your writing look choppy and awkward. If you find yourself sprinkling them around liberally, ask yourself whether all those asiders really need to be included. Parentheses are useful for accomplishing the following: working in digression. For example, the race for second place, third place of course was the foregone conclusion, was still wide open. Making complex text easier to follow. For example, the Save As feature lets you save an existing file under a new name to either the main drive or extra drive, so that you now have two copies of the same file. Setting off minor details. The settlement is 80 kilometers, about 50 miles, from the nearest town. The one-way fare is $200 US. Dashes. Dashes come in several sizes, so strictly speaking, the term refers to more than one mark. There is an N dash, which is roughly the width of the capital letter N in whatever font it is being used, the M dash, which is the width of the letter M, and the 2M dash and 3M dash, which are the widths of 2 and 3 side by side, ATS respectively. Not every font will follow this specification literally. The important point is that an N dash is distinctively longer than a hyphen, and M dash is longer than an N dash, and 2 M dashes is longer than an M dash, and 3 M dash is the longest of all. The M dash is by far the most commonly used of all marks, and except to sticklers such as editors and typesetters, is almost always what is meant by the unqualified term dash. The N dash has its uses but comes up in only a few specialized circumstances, while 2 and 3 M dashes are downright esoteric. The M dash. The M dash serves the following functions: marking off the descriptive element of digression. For example, the board members, with the conspicuous absence of the president, met to discuss the missing funds. Marking an abrupt break in structure or turn in content. For example, the mother of our particular hobbit. What is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need some description nowadays. Indicating interrupted or scattered speech. For example, not so loud, for God's sake, Caulfield. If you can't manage to keep your voice down, let's drop the whole. All right, but listen, I said. I was getting excited and I was talking a little too loud. Sometimes I talk a little loud when I get excited. The catcher of the rye. Setting off the source of quotation. For example, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. Woody Allen. The and dash. The and dash has two primary functions, linking elements, for example, 10:30, 10:45, substituting for a hyphen in case where a hyphen could be unclear, the ex-prime minister or a non-computer expert. Brackets. People often interchange the words brackets and parentheses, but aside from some minor overlaps, these punctuation marks have quite distinct uses. Brackets have two primary functions: identifying changes to quoted material, for example, original quotation. Her library, for example, includes all the works of Grass and Day-Lewis. Revised version, her library, for example, includes all the works of German writer Gunther, Grass, and British poet Cecil Day-Lewis. Enclosing digression within parentheses. Quotation marks. Quotation marks have several distinct functions: setting off dialogue, setting off citations, setting off words that are meant in a special way, setting off titles. For example, the reporter would only say that the report had been leaked to him by a congressional source. Ellipses. The ellipsis, from the Greek to leave out or fall short, has three distinct functions: indicating omissions in quoted material, indicating hesitation or trailing off in spoken words, imparting extra significance to a sentence. For example, I was going to ask to see the rubies when the phone rang, and Gatsby took up the receiver. Yes? Well, I can't talk now. I can't talk now, old sport. I said a small town. He must know what a small town is. Well, he's of no use to us if Detroit is his idea of the small town. He rang off. Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. Apostrophe. The apostrophe is put in the wrong place and added where it doesn't belong or omitted. The confusion over this much abused mark probably arises out of the fact that it has three completely independent uses, each of which applies under some circumstances but not others. These functions are the following: indicating omissions in contracted words, for example, she couldn't make it; indicative possessives, Mr. Smith's apartment; indicating plurals, to put the program in insert mode, type to eyes, otherwise could look like is.